I'm Alan Brunsman, as I say in Yellow Springs. I'm Becky's husband. This is the second part of the series, and in this part, it's a lot more familiar to me because I'm in most of it. I was associated with Lee for about 35 years, and we were sort of worked parallel. He would do projects and I would do similar projects, and then we'd cross stuff and then we'd cross back. It just was, I only worked forwardly about 2 years, and even then it wasn't forwardly, it was the same thing except the title was different. Okay, let me start. This part is about Dr. Leland Clark Jr., part 2 from about 1950 to now. For some reason that's fuzzy. Okay, Dr. Clark, 1918 to 2005. This again is my timeline, and I'm going to get my magic stick. You know, it starts out here at Antioch College, Yellow Springs. And you can follow through the things. I'll go through most of them. You know, artificial kidney, heart lung machine, so on and so forth. But then he moved to Alabama in 1958 and stayed there until 1968, when he moved to Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And then he came back to Antioch and Yellow Springs in 91 and was there until he died. Lived there. Actually had houses in both places, Cincinnati and there. Okay. So a little bit of a review on the first part. Too many things in my hand. He worked for Fells, okay? And Fells didn't want anything to do with his extra projects. Maybe that's too strong, but you know, they basically was, you know, was make sure he worked for them and that these things were extra. And he developed a model for a kidney machine, developed a heart lung machine. He developed the O2 electrode and temperature probes, worked with YSI, and they developed a model for the blood gas machine. This is overdone. A dialysis machine today looks like that. It's an artificial kidney. He collaborated with YSI and did the heart-lung machine, people from YSI, and thermistor with Hardy Trolander, and the Clark oxygen electrode with YSI. That's a picture of Lee and the glass and stainless steel parts, main stainless steel parts of the heart-lung machine. I am just entirely impressed with this, and then this shot, which shows the magnitude of the size of this device. And this was developed, I have to be astonished every time I say it. This was developed basically by people, maybe 2 or 3 people, after work. And all the machining, electronics, and everything else, I mean, they just, I can't imagine doing that. I've developed products for, God, forever, and that still looks big to me, you know. They developed the heart lung machine and took 100 individual tests that had no failures to make sure they could go one step farther, which was take it down to Cincinnati, which is where the operating room was for the people. That's an idea of thermistors. Thermistors and YSI is a big deal. It's a lot of product. At least it was a lot of product. The oxygen electrode is basically showing, you know, you got electrolyte in a well here, you got a membrane there. And the basics of this, without the membrane, were known for quite a while. And what Lee did was he added a membrane which separated the outside fluid here from the inside fluid there. And the inside fluid would get contaminated by the outside and the probe would die. But by putting in this membrane, which allowed oxygen to go through and not the contaminants, it would contaminate the electrode, it works. It works very well. As a matter of fact, it's called the Clark O2 electrode, and still today. And that was, you know, in the 50s. He also did one of the first blood gas machines. That's a present blood gas machine. And there's what, you know, it measures essentials for diagnosing mandatory respiratory and metabolic disorders. And it's, if you watch a medical show on TV, you'll hear them say, get a blood gas. Okay, well that's what they're talking about. Get a blood gas, that's what's happening. It tells you about, without getting into the specifics of it, the situation of that person relative to the oxygen and, well, things listed there. All right, now part two of the 60s. Well, there it is. He starts out in Alabama and comes back to Cincinnati, and well, we've got to go through these things. I joined Yellow Springs Instrument Company in 1968. Lee demonstrated the biosensor at a meeting in Cincinnati between Harvey Trolander, the CEO of YSI, and Fred Hooven. And Fred Hooven, there's books on Fred Hooven. Fred Hooven invented, designed, developed, produced products for automotive, aviation, biomedical, printing, whatever. The radio directional finder for planes he developed, and is still using it. I mean, it's just incredible stuff. And I did tell you that story about it. I have to repeat it. That he one time drove a Cadillac, as in working for one of the companies, automobile companies. He drove a Cadillac, must have been General Motors, obviously, to lunch. And when he came out from lunch, he looked at his car, and there was a woman standing beside it saying, "Oh, it's terrible, terrible, I backed into your car." And he walked over and says, "Oh, don't worry about it, we're going to crush it tomorrow." I love that story. Okay, here's the experiment, which, as far as I can presume how it went. Okay, you have an electrical circuit here, which has a silver and platinum electrode in the solution. The solution, the saline solution, saltwater solution, and it has an enzyme called glucose oxidase in it. And over here is a glucose solution. So this is basically a solution with an enzyme in it. Okay, I'll get to the next slide and show you what an enzyme is. Okay, so here we are, and again, that's a glucose solution. Notice the meters, the bottom of the scale. All right. Pour the glucose solution in here, and the enzyme reacts with the glucose, and that's what's up there, to form hydrogen peroxide and gluconic acid. Right? What is an enzyme? An enzyme is a catalyst for changing groups of things to something else and not being used up in the process. So to me, it's magic. You know, you got something here that it just stays there and gathers things up and puts things else out and doesn't get involved in the process at all. So the hydrogen peroxide, the platinum electrode is saying, takes hydrogen peroxide, now with the electric current, changes that back into water and oxygen, and 2 electrons go around the loop, and you got a meter reading, current. It looks extremely simple, but you know, nobody else has done it, and it's a combination of things. It's a combination of the solutions and the electrodes and the enzymes, and people have never put the combination together. And some things, inventions like that, are pretty simple, but people just never thought of them before. All right, here's the patent on that. And here's a drawing of an electrode. And you'll notice down here, this is trying to show two electrodes, right, middle A and B. And so what is happening? It required two electrodes, again, fuzzy drawing of that. All right, now here, electrode 1. This is the membrane electrode, another membrane electrode, and this is the platinum sensing. Okay, the outside membrane has big holes in it, but it keeps out red blood cells, white blood cells, boulders, whatever. Okay, and then this one is interferences. In this model, which was in the patent, interferences go all the way through. None of these membranes stop the interferences. Okay, the glucose goes through and reacts with the glucose oxidase and produces hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide reacts and produces oxygen and so forth, as I showed before. All right, so what's unique about this, what's bad about this, is that it does measure glucose, but the interferences still come through. All right, so you never always Tylenol, acetic acid. I mean, there's quite a few things that interfere and react with the electrode without needing an enzyme to get there. And so that would give you a false reading. All right. So Lee's solution to that, again, the outside membrane is the same, and he runs a second electrode and just measures the interferences. Okay. So his solution was to subtract the second electrode from the first one, therefore, and get rid of the interferences. And that was the basis of his solution. There's the second electrode, yeah, you got that. And this is just a membrane. There's two probes with membranes, 1 and 2. One had enzyme, one no, and then it's pretty much the same as the oxygen electrode that went through. Okay, the patent agreement, YSI and Radiometer of Denmark licensed the patent. Together, they agreed to share all information, designs, and patents. That is unusual. It's very unusual. That's a YSI. I don't know whether Lee was all into that too, but it was a YSI thing. They just believed in, we don't hold on to stuff. We let the world have it. And other companies could also license Lee's patent. It turned out that it was unique enough when it was developed that other people just couldn't do it or didn't do it. I mean, I didn't see people doing the same thing we ended up finally developing for years and years and years, 20 years probably. All right, in '69, Leland Clark, YSI, Radiometer, all started working on the project in parallel. In other words, there was a group, Lee in Cincinnati, that did work. There was a YSI did work, and Radiometer. And they all worked independently, but shared the information. Okay, Ed Malloy was the leader of the new products group at YSI and started the project. Okay, they wanted to develop a clinical instrument. Okay, it's a clinical instrument to measure glucose. This is just, at the start of the project, they laid down some things that they thought it ought to have. It ought to have 5% accuracy. It ought to use just 25 microliters, plus 25 microliters. It's about 50 microliters in a bubble, in a droplet. So it gives you an idea of the size of the sample. In other words, you can finger stick and pick up that or something like that. It's measured at body temperature. Measurements should take less than a minute. 2 minutes to return to backward the start so you can run another sample. Cost per test should be under $1, and the membrane should last at least 1 week. Now these are the original specs. These are what people, okay, hand me that. Now I'm going to try and design to this. All right, in the 70s, Ed Malloy, manager of the products department, died in 1970. Yep. I can tell I'm not keeping up with this. Okay. And again, I came to YSI in 1968, and what is it? It's 1970. And I was just 2 years out of college. And I was assigned to take over the lead in this project. And my background at this point was electrical engineering bachelor's and mechanical engineering master's. So, you know, it didn't say in there medical or clinical or anything like that. You know, I was just handed this project. So, you know, typical characteristic is I was standing there and there was nobody else. And I had this project with those requirements.
What field would that be under?
Biomedical.
Biomedical.
And then biomedical can go into all parts of you're building something, you know, mechanical parts, now software parts, now hardware parts, they're, you know, electronics, I mean, it's all that kind of stuff. So, and they were all on that list, by the way. Okay, I put together a team. It's composed of me, David Newman, and Jeff Huntington. People may know who these people are here. We designed and built the YSI 23. That was the first instrument we built. That's what a 23 looked like. Okay. We went to Copenhagen to share our project so far in 73 August with me, David, Jeff, Hardy, and Lee. And Ray Elmer. Okay, Ray Elmer showed us desalination membrane. They were using it on another similar product. Okay, what's the desalination membrane? Desalination is used for removing salt from salt water, whatever, okay. And it has a support membrane because what happens is the flow goes through here as you're done filtering, and you have high pressure here forcing the water through. So the support membrane gives it some support. What else can I do? And it had on top of that 2-micron thick filter layer. Okay. We discovered, we bought some of their desalination membranes and put it in a standard 23 probe. I think I've got it back up right here. And maybe I didn't see it. We were selling 23s on market, and we discovered that the Lee's approach didn't work. The second electrode didn't subtract the interferences. It just subtracted interferences for every interference, but they were all different subtractions. So, you know, you have one interference which is stronger than another one, you get an answer and you balance that out, then you have it opposite and you balance something else out and it give you a wrong answer. So it really didn't work. So as I said, we bought some of the membranes and we literally took them and placed them inside the YSI electrode membrane right before the platinum, okay? It had a filter membrane, enzyme layer membrane, and then we put the dialysis membrane, and then the platinum. Okay. All right. So what we did, this is the electrode 1, which I showed you earlier, and we put the desalination membrane here, okay? And when we did that, the output readings just, it got rid of noise and all kinds of things. And if you shot a sample in, it would go up and flatten off perfectly flat and look like forever. The only problem was a rise there was maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes back to the requirements, and then it would stay there. And to clean it out was another. So you ended up just to run a couple samples with, I don't know, half an hour, you know, which wasn't acceptable for designing a clinical instrument. So what we assigned David to do was to see if he could produce the the CA layer, the outside layer that kept the salt out, right? And not have the support layer, right? To give you some numbers, that layer was about 2 microns thick, all right? And a micron is that, not much. And contact lens is 100 microns. Okay, so, you know, we're trying to produce something that has no rigidity to it at all. Where you see this, if you put a drop of oil on water, it goes whoosh, and you can see colors. Okay, it sees colors because it's in the area of a wavelength of light. And this membrane is in the same order. So, you know, you're trying to make something that's about as thick as a layer of oil on water. Okay, now how do you do that? If you try other methods of making it, such as painting it or coating it by dipping it in things, you're going to get a lot more. You know, it's like trying to put on a very thin layer of paint. No, you can't do that. Okay, so David came up with a way to make this package. And it looked like this. The CA, which is that final filter we're talking about. This is where the enzyme is for its reaction. And this is the bolters and so forth filter area. Okay, so you have glucose plus glucose oxidase, conic, well, what acid, and hydrogen peroxide. All right, that's what the whole thing looked like. Membrane. It's a platinum electrode, around it is a silver electrode, and it's all mounted onto a O-ring. So you just, we ship the O-rings, which they may still do, in contact lens cases. That's what they fit in really nice. Okay, this is David's patent on that process. All right, here's a summary. 23 projects started in '69. The instrument was recalled in '73 because it didn't work. Actually, we had them out in the market. We took that, from that position, we started the 23A project, which was the next generation. And it was completed in '74. I sort of put this in the same category as Lee's heart-lung machine. What? I mean, you wouldn't believe the complexity of things in that. Okay, there's me, David, Jeff, and many other people from the just engineering department. Okay, in 23A included the new sensor. It used 25 microns. Now compare these to the specs I did right at the first. It took 1 minute or less, actually. It's like 45 seconds or 30 seconds to do a reading. It was under 2 minutes between samples, you know, that's pretty quick. And in '75, we had a keychain we sold, we gave people in advertising, and it said, have your next glucose test on us, and it had 2 pennies in it. And so that's the price for somebody that, in a lab that wanted to produce that glucose measurement. That's what it would cost. Because the membranes lasted, it doesn't say on there, okay, the membranes lasted months. And so you basically had the cost of the membrane and salt water. And that was, you know, it didn't cost much. So compared to what was previously the chemistry methods were very intense. I mean, they just take, I don't know how long, let's say a half hour to do the measurement. And it involved a lab personnel doing the whole thing. And this one, you know, you just literally picked a sample up and shot it into the instrument and walked away. And it's just all it took. It cleaned itself. Anyway. Okay.
And this was like just a little bitty bit of whole blood? That
Yep.
Yeah.
25 microliters.
As opposed to the stuff in the lab, because they're...
Oh, they want vacuum cleaners.
That's what I think. They had to basically get serum out of that, and you have to spin the cells in order to get the blood cells out.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah,
The clicker just fired.
yeah.
Just for curiosity, at one time, a person from Radiometer came here, and this is before we went there. And this guy was a research person at Radiometer, and then that's me and Hardy Trolander, and a picture above my desk. So we did this, inserted the salination, remember we talked about that, we talked about the thicknesses, we showed how it's done, we showed membrane, we showed base pattern. All right, and we talked about this. All right. Oh, back one. When that instrument came out in '74, the FDA had decided that they ought to be regulating instruments for medicine. And before that, you just produced something, said what it did, and sold it to people, believe it or not. And so, I mean, right there, we're ready to release this product, and we got right into the laying out of the rules. And as YSI normally would do, we got right in the middle of it and helped them design it and write stuff and all this kind of stuff. And we're probably the first, I know we were the first glucose instrument to pass the test. And what's interesting about it is they had a separate test for brand new instruments that didn't look like anything in the past, and one called these for grandfather parts. And that means you're taking something and making an improvement in it, okay? And that was called a 510K. I'll bet every instrument in this field now is done with a 510K. Matter of fact, most medical products are done with 510K. And ours, the one we 510K'd on, was nothing, had nothing to do with this. But that's just the way we laid the background for that, and now everybody does it that way. Okay. That instrument, 23A, was uses the gold standard for testing new instruments. If somebody came up with another way to measure glucose and they wanted to get it on the market and go through the FDA compared it to that instrument. It was that accurate. The instrument was selected as one of 50 instruments that was changed the world in the 20th century. I like that. And there's a magazine that has IR 100 selects one of the top new inventions of the year, and it was listed as one of those. That one, you know. When we got this on the market, a guy named Tom Clemens, who worked for Miles Laboratory, and Tom had developed the colorimetric way of measuring glucose sticks. I don't even know what glucose stick is.
Urine?
Pardon?
For like urine, you mean?
This was for blood glucose.
Blood, okay.
And what you did with those glucose sticks was you put blood on them, and then you rinsed it or whatever it is, and it turned color. Then you had a bottle here, and you took that up and said, it's about that color. And that's the way you measured it. It's just, you know, not very accurate. So he developed a small portable colorimeter, something that would read color. And you put the sticks in there, and it would tell you what the glucose value was. That was extremely profitable for Miles. And what he did was he wanted to incorporate our electrode into his instrument. He was trying to build he called it a biostator, which is an artificial pancreas. Why did he want it? Because he was doing wet chemistry in that machine, and you can't imagine what that was like to maintain and do and everything. So there it is. It's first complete artificial pancreas. It gave you insulin or sugar as necessary. You hooked the patient up to it, and it controlled the person. It used YSI membranes. It was manufactured in the 70s. It was mainly used in hospitals to stabilize patients. People would come in and their glucose was all over the place, and you'd shoot them. At the time, they didn't want to do fast glucose measurements. You'd shoot them with glucose, and that'd be the time they needed insulin. And by the time you figured that out, you'd shoot them with insulin, and they'd go the other way. So, that machine controlled them. And so you could go to pick somebody that was having problems being stable on glucose, hook them up to that machine. And just move them like that. It was mainly used in Germany. There was a lot of work was done with that machine in Germany. It never quite caught on in the United States. And I think the bottom line is why that's true. It's very expensive. I think it was probably $100,000 then. But had a computer and all this chemistry and whatever. Okay, we had the 23 on the market. And then one day, Leland comes in and says, I think you guys ought to be measuring lactic acid, lactate. And the formula for that is oxygen plus the enzyme, lactic oxidase, produce hydrogen products, peroxide, and byproducts. And at the time, if you read the literature, it said it didn't do that. And Lee, his normal Lee, said, I don't believe that. So we removed the glucose oxidase from the membrane, put in lactate oxidase, and then measured lactate. Just that simple. And again, other people were completely discouraged about that kind of measurement because it didn't work. Okay, why do you want to know lactic acid? It's an indicator when you don't have enough oxygen present. In other words, if I'm in a hospital or something like that, for some reason my lungs aren't working right, or my body goes to another mechanism named
anaerobic metabolism.
This is a test.
It shifts over from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism and generates lactate as the byproduct.
Right. And the same thing happens with septic hepatitis. If you have an infection, what happens is the bacteria grab up the oxygen. Okay, so your body again starts making lactic acid. So it's a very good indicator that you have an infection.
If you track the lactate, you can actually tell approximately when somebody's going to die because of the slope and the increase. So you know how much time you have by tracking that, and then there's ways to reverse it.
Right.
And so then you have to aggressively pursue that reversal, and then you can see you've done the right thing.
Yeah.
So it's pretty direct.
And in sports, people are very interested when they run out of oxygen. If you're running a track thing or something like that, your lactate will stay reasonably constant. And when you run out of oxygen, it takes off. So you would like to know where that elbow is, and what you'd like to do is push it out. And my son did a lot of swimming, and a guy he swam against had an extremely good lactate out there. And he had an advantage. Whatever his body was doing, that was magic about being able to do that. He had an advantage in a race, but he wouldn't run out of oxygen. Or whatever. The salespeople decided that that would be a good ad for it. So we made there's one of them back there, made these little things and set them around the shows and so forth. In 84, for the 84 Olympics, as I recall, the Olympic team trained actually at Wright State for a while. And they contacted us and set up a lactate analyzer and trained against that lactate analyzer at that time. I don't know how much it helped them or not, but I know that China bought a bunch of the instruments for the next Olympics, and they did really well. So, could be true. We also did a lot of other chemistries. Here's a list of some of them. similar to the lactate, Lee coming in and telling us to do that. Lee came in and told us that, oh, we can do cholesterol. Okay, so we made a cholesterol instrument. And this is not a complete list at this point. Basically, if you have an enzyme labeled oxidase, the odds are it probably produces hydrogen peroxide, and therefore you can probably measure what it is with that. And it's worked out pretty true. And there's the top part of a note I got back from Lee. And I asked him on the Friday, whatever that day was, about potential value of combining glucose and lactate in an instrument. And he said enthusiastically, yes. And basically, what he's saying here is, and it follows through what Rob was saying, if you are producing carbon dioxide and protons, you're healthy. If you're producing lactate protons, you're sick. And so it's just an indicator of your body. And he went, there's probably 3 pages after that. It tells all the reasons and so much chemistry you wouldn't believe. And, yes. And they now produce NYSI lactate instrument. Lactate glucose. In 1995, we left Children's Hospital Research Foundation in Cincinnati and joined SBI, which is Synthetic Blood International. Synthetic blood was into synthetic blood, and their scientists died, and therefore we're looking for somebody else to pick up the charge. And so they found Lee and they hired him. Okay. Lee moved back to Yellow Springs, set up a lab in the Kettering building on the Antioch campus. After he came back here, he came up to me and said, I'd like to have you work for me on a implantable glucose project. And so I quit YSI and went to work for the synthetic blood, basically. That's the Kettering building. We had the second, third floor, partial of the second, third floor. Lee's group did artificial blood, liquid breathing, implantable. He worked on the implantable sensor. My group worked on the implantable sensor plus the case and circuit for that. Lee did some work with the case and circuit too. My team was Kevin Hauser, Foodlaw, Tom Lemire's, David McDaniel, and Joan Stevens. You see there, as normal with my groups, people cross every line in there. The problems with going from a 23A to an implantable device was oxygen glucose ratio in the human body. Jump ahead one. Stoichiometry, the ratio of glucose to oxygen in a sample, you just pick up a sample, is 25 to 1. There's more glucose than there is oxygen. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with equations, but if I run out of this, that equation doesn't work.
So it becomes an oxygen sensor.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes an oxygen sensor. So you need to get this above the glucose to measure glucose. And the other thing worked on was the stability of the glucose oxidase in vitro. In other words, how long will the glucose oxidase last in the membrane? Now, we're trying to go, we wanted to be able to make an instrument that could plant in somebody for 2 years. So you had to keep the enzyme active for 2 years. And then there was the biocompatibility, with the sensor membrane and case. You know, if you're going to put it in somebody, it has to be biocompatible with them. Let's see where we go here. This is just the purple line here is a sample of the stoichiometry. This happens to be in, where does it say? Oh, there it is, sorry. 5% oxygen, measurement in 5% oxygen, and room air is 21%. And so it has what I was talking about. It measures along until here, and then it dies because it ran out of oxygen. The typical 23A probe uses round off at 60. This one happens to round off, looks like, you know, maybe 40, and then goes flat. So that's a typical YSI. In other words, you try to use a membrane. We use an YSI on whole blood, you would get this kind of response, which you can't measure past about 60 with it. In 23A, we eliminated the O2 problem by diluting the sample approximately 13 to 1. Okay, so we saturated the sample with solution buffer that's already oxygen in it. So that got the oxygen level up to match the glucose level. After everyone had been hired, we had a group meeting. In that meeting, we produced many ideas on solving the oxygen problem. I produced an idea, produced a membrane implement that the group liked, and they asked me to comment, to document it. Elmo and Tom were assigned to try to do that approach. And this is the patent, and it's got me and Elmo on both of them. And it worked. The normal YSI membrane shows here glucose producing hydrogen peroxide platinum, and then oxygen, okay, so catalase, which is also a product of the reaction. Okay, but this is the one that rounds. In other words, we run out of oxygen. My suggestion was that we put some storage into that, and it worked. And this is an example of a membrane with that storage in it. And we decided that it only rounded off because the instrument couldn't go any farther. People love to, you know, if you're over 250, who cares? Okay, we made a device to be implanted in an animal. And the device, the basic compatibility was it had a titanium case. And why titanium? Titanium cases were used for pacemakers. So that seemed like a good starting point. The first cases we used were pacemaker cases. And the pacemaker cases, to put them together at that time, were welded. So you build everything inside, weld the case, and then test it. The battery died, you were done, because it was hard to open those things up. And if you did something wrong, you were done. So it was hard to make changes to that. You basically had one chance. And so Tom Lemires came in one day and said, well, people make watches that are waterproof. Why can't we make this a watch? And so we designed it as a threaded cap. And it worked great. So this thing had a printed circuit board with a battery on it, put in there. And then we had two electrodes, one silver and one platinum. And I give Tom Lemires a lot of credit here. He came up with the idea of the threaded case. And we needed to seal the metals into this glass, into this electrode housing. And he came up with glass encapsulation for the platinum and for the silver. Because if you use the standard YSI, we build them into the standard YSI electrodes at the time, we build them in plastic, epoxy. Well, epoxy dies after a while. It dies. I don't know why. So we wanted something that was going to last 2 years, so we, did that. And again, that was Tom Lemire's. Tom Lemire's had a lot of history in putting metals into glass, and so worked out great. And this transmitted to a computer. Okay, so what we did was put this in an animal, and we were very careful in picking animals. This town is pretty rough on you for that. And it was a premature rat they were just about ready to get rid of. And we picked big ones. So we had a rat that's like this. Because we don't want to put that in it, so it's a pretty good object. And this transmitted to a receiver that was underneath the rat and was recorded by a computer. Worked great. All right, our test of this setup was to, first, we were going to do 3 different things. We're going to do, first of all, do temperature. So we designed it with a closed case, no electrodes, anything else, okay, so we're just going to measure the temperature of the case inside the rat. And this shows the cycles of, daily cycles of temperature in a living thing. And it worked. The next thing we did was, okay, can we build an oxygen electrode into this? So we took and made it into a glucose, an oxygen measuring device. In other words, used the Clark oxygen electrode and recorded the readings out of it and gave the animal oxygen at times, and you can see that it did work. All right, the last test. We put the glucose here, all right? And you can see the glucose varies very much. And when we put in a bolus, a large amount of glucose, it would show up on it. So we assumed we had good setup. This one was for 35 days, only 35 days, because the company shut down at that point. They closed down the project. This is some of the similar membranes that were just tested at different intervals, put back in an instrument, taken out of an instrument, put back in an instrument. And this is one specific membrane. And it had the weird characteristic that it got more and more life, whatever the hell. I don't know why. But it kept looking better. I'm sure out there someplace it started dying, but it didn't at the start. All right, this is the SBI patent on the device. So today, several companies are building implantables. Dexcom, is the one on the back of people's arms. And I'm absolutely sure they're using that technology. Medtronic, Abbott. And then there's this company, Eversense, which has come up with a totally implantable. These are done with needles that go into the arm. And so you're measuring the glucose in the interstitial fluid with a needle that goes into the arm and comes back. And so it doesn't transmit out of it, it just measures it right in place. And they last for about 7 days. And then you got to put another one in. Eversense is showing that they have a continuous, and I think they're the one, I'm sure they're the one, that says it's implantable. And their implantable will go up to 10 days. So you would have to have it implant a new one every 10 days. That's a picture of somebody with a Dexcom mounted on their arm. If you go back to the original timeline, you'll see that liquid breathing actually started in about 66. And the first experiment which I talked about last time, was taking a mouse and putting it in a beaker of poly,
What's that now?
the liquid.
Yeah, that's subfluorocarbon liquid.
But anyway, she did a search on liquid breathing, and I mean, I haven't digested this whole thing, but you can imagine there's quite a bit of liquid breathing stuff. They've gotten into using it for various things and developing machines that will do the putting it in, taking it out. It's, if you want to know about liquid breathing, I can make a copy of this, I'll give you where it's at. That's the mouse experiment. Spielberg had heard about the mouse experiment and was doing the movie The Abyss, and he wanted to include the mouse in the mouse experiment in the movie. And if you see the movie, there's a mouse running around almost in a lot of the movie. And so he sent a letter to Lee and said, what would it cost me to use this in the movie? And Lee said, just sign this picture. And so that's what he did. He's to Dr. Clark, Steven Spielberg, squeak, squeak in the middle there. And it got into the movie. Okay, fluorocarbons. Dissolve oxygen and CO2, not combining like hemoglobin. MAI, absorb O2 and CO2 via contact with the liquid. And this is where the ventilators, one of these is just a whole bunch of different ways of ventilators, of using them in that. Different treatments. If you use the total liquid, like we were talking about with the mouse, you need a ventilator to do it correctly on a person. Partial, they just put partial into there, and it's a different set of things, situations they can solve. They also talk about treating stuff with vapors, aerosol, and that liquid, since you're taking over the lungs, can basically control the body temperature. And why is that important? If somebody needs the temperature of their body raised or lowered, and they try and do it with salt water, water or something like that, the body is a very good insulator, and so it's very hard to do. They cool the IV and stuff like that. But if you fill your lungs up with the solution, the body will follow that. And so one place where they talk about using it is in brain protection. If you have a head injury, now I'm guessing here, the temperature of the brain can cause damage. And so they use it to cool the body and save the brain. All right, medical uses. Protecting preemies whose lungs haven't been developed totally. Respiratory disease syndrome, lung injury. Oops, sorry. Use it during surgery and carbon dioxide poisoning.
Alan,
Yes.
question, are these actually happening, or was it just these theories of how it would be used?
I think, well,
The first one was Tom Schaefer in Philadelphia, and he used it on preterm babies. And it was only on babies that were guaranteed to die. And so it proved it was successful. And so that one I know was used. I can't speak to the other ones.
Lee has a patent on treating the lung injury. And as Rob was saying that if you're doing a heart-lung thing, you would like to have extra fluids. And sometimes it's hard to get enough extra fluid to run a heart-lung. And so use that as a supplement. And I have no idea whether they use it for carbon dioxide. There were some experiments. There's a group that was doing experiments on deep sea diving, much like the Abyss. And I don't know if anybody did space travel. MRI imaging and drug delivery. Did you get into
That was
MRI?
with, the imaging was with brominated perfluorocarbons.
Okay.
And it showed density on X-ray. And so you could do that. And then it was also used for ocular surgery.
Mhm.
So, you know, you normally have an ad in, when they're operating on the retina, where you'd have an air bubble, and you'd have to turn the patient upside down, and the air bubble would hold the retina in place. Well, they would inject it with the perfluorocarbon liquid at twice the density of water, and so now that would hold the retina in place with the person looking up. So the surgeon didn't have to climb under the bed to do the surgery, he could do it from above.
The story on that is a typical Lee Clark, in that he had eye problems. And so he went to a doctor and was always talking to him. And the rest is self-evident.
That's right.
Actually, he patented it too. All right. Drowning victims. I was watching one of these 911 things, and they had somebody that was drowning. They pulled him out of the water. And it looked like just, you know, if they had instantly the artificial, the liquid breathing, I'd send that into their lungs and let it clear. And what would it do? It replaced the water and it reopened the alkali and dilute and remove debris and cool the body. Actually, the one I saw, they wanted to warm the body, but you know, it would do all that, and it could do it easily. So, you know, do they have that? Not that I know of. I don't know why not. But part of it's also in here is that one experiment where the guy got pneumonia. I think it was him. But anyway, the FDA decided that it wasn't a good thing, and they really blackballed him. So, you know, it just may be held up because they can't get permission to do experiments. All right, this is one of his patents in this area, and I liked it because it was titled "Method for Assisting Mammals Having a Lung Disorder to Breathe Ambient, gas normally." Okay, and this is '98, and it was assigned to Synthetic Blood, who changed its name to Tamarack Therapeutics. Oh, ideas. Actually, the top one there I found in one of the lists, even though I had it myself. During COVID, since it was a lot of lung problems, I thought that, you know, there ought to be something you could do with this fluid to help these people that can't breathe. You know, it's this. And I sent out letters to the governor and to senator and something like that. You know, who am I? Never got a response. You got temperature control of the body, drug delivery, mucus removal, sports. This is one I hadn't seen anybody do. My thought. I could see people using this to treat athletes so that they could, back to lactic acid. You're ending up with a storage of oxygen in their lungs, and so that may be able to run farther, swim farther, or whatever it is. I mean, somehow I got turned on by horse racing and lactic acid, and went to a few races and found out those people will treat horses with anything that isn't on their magic list that you can't do. They treat them with bicarbonate or something to get the lactic acid down. I don't have the slightest idea whether that helps or not. But I mean, you could talk to these people and they just, all kinds of things they would do. So, you know, you see, well, that's enough for that subject. All right, artificial blood. That's the same experiment, got it going. Does not use hemoglobin, emulsions, carry the oxygen, potential replacement, and supply donor blood in emergencies. I don't know why. It may be. I've had indications that it is used in military, but I haven't had a absolutely it's being used.
It was a storage issue in the field.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was the big.
storage and type, yeah.
What I've recently read is that there's a big problem getting blood donors,
Yeah.
period.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And you would only need it for a temporary, what do they do in the emergency situation? Well, people have been bleeding, they want to get the liquids in the body up. What do they give them? They give them a saline solution, an IV of salt water, basically. And what does that do for carrying oxygen? Nothing. So, it'd be nice to have something in there. It could only be a short time, time enough to get somebody someplace where you can give them blood. It's just, I don't know, it's Green Cross approached Lee, and I'm not sure how much of it he was involved with, but he came up with a blood substitute, okay? And they took it to market. And the FDA approved it for patients, and it required a high oxygen supplement, eventually discontinued. Here's a little bit of my story. At that time, I knew Lee pretty well, and he told me about this Green Cross Corporation. Oh, if they start using his stuff, maybe that thing will bloom. So I went out and bought some Green Cross stock.
That probably didn't work out too well.
Didn't work out too well. And the one thing you notice is this clear, colorless liquid, which is interesting. And then if you get an injection, if you get an IV of the artificial blood, your color doesn't have a nice red to it anymore. After the Green Cross, Lee was joined with synthetic blood, and they came up with oxalate. Okay, in the artificial blood, they use two solutions, and if you mixed them together, they would separate. One would be here and one would be here, and they wouldn't mix. So, homogenized the fluid, so they had to take and make one into dissolve in the other one. So, they homogenized, and homogenizing, the best example of it is milk. You've got this heavy, I don't know if you're old enough to have known. Some of you look like you're old enough. When you buy milk, and it'd be, this and this, and you have to shake it up to, okay, well, they figured out that if they ran it through an homogenizer, okay, and made the particles of the cream real small, it stayed in the solution. Okay, so that's what you had to do with the blood. You had to make these small particles. And it's used in, different applications: food, material science, pharmaceuticals. It makes that uniformity through the solution, stability, it lasts, and texture, complete appearance. Okay. Method, homogenizing. It's a mechanical way where you actually use high pressure and you force it through a small hole. It's ultrasonic, where you just use an ultrasonic wad and use it to make the small pieces. And so supposedly you can do it with thermal. Make it molten. Okay, a red blood cell is about 6 to 8 microns oxygen carrying particle size, and the artificial blood is 0.2. It's about 35 times smaller than a red blood cell. So what's the advantage of that? It goes a lot of places red blood cells don't go. So if you got a reason that you need to get back to COVID, you need to get oxygen someplace, this can get into very, very, very small blood. Some applications of the artificial blood. Jehovah's Witnesses refuse blood transmission in their interpretation of scripture. So they actually, again, this ER woman that I talked to said that she had a child and they refused to give it, and the child died. And a friend of ours said that across the street from where she lives, a similar instance. Rather than take any of this, not any of this, rather than take normal blood transfusion, they'd let the kid die. I don't know. But, I got one more on that. There's a consent form that you get in the hospital. And it allows them to inform consent and using artificial blood substitutes. Let's see if there's anything else
All
on this.
hospitals have it.
I have no idea. This ER nurse I talked to, she knew about it. Just a patent in this area showing emulsifying the perfluorinated cyclic hydrocarbons. Perfluortan, if I said that right. Which is called blue blood, and it's medical use in Russia. And they use it for therapeutics, hypothermia, cardiovascular origin, and tissue preservation, research use, and actually for COVID. Recent publications. Oh,
This is where the...
well, it's interesting when I get into this. I would touch an area and, say, okay, liquid breathing. I'd touch it and, I knew little about it, the mouse and stuff like that, and I'd get into it, and then I'd go a little ways, and then I'd open it up, and then I'd go a little farther, and then, the last thing on the liquid breathing stuff, I got this note from that ER surgeon that she'd done a search on it, and, there's just the long story of liquid breathing. It is the long story. So, typical. Lee just touches stuff and shows how to do it, and then it explodes. And this is the end. Basically, what I come away with on this is that Lee touched God. I mean, one place I read, he had 40 different significant inventions. I can't get past about 5 of them, and if they're significant and as significant as those 5, I also have read someplace, I think it was a local one, matter of fact, Dorothy Scott and somebody else, we looked into trying to see if we can nominate him for Swedish award. Nobel. My mind just went blank there. No, because I really think he deserved it. I really think he did enough significance to saving lives. There's probably, God, it's hard to say anybody hasn't been touched by it.
For the Nobel Prize, anybody can nominate anybody. And I think that in one of the crossword puzzles I had this week in the New York Times, said there was somebody who was nominated, who was actually received it posthumously, so.
Oh, yeah?
I'd go for it. Well.
I didn't know such existed. We looked into it and it just looked like I don't know,
Anybody can nominate, if Trump has already been nominated for the Peace Prize. One of the Antioch professors, whose name is escaping me right now, actually wrote a very authoritative book on the Nobel Peace Prize. And he gave a lecture on it when the book came out, but he said basically anybody could nominate anybody.
Oh.
So
I didn't think, the time we looked into it, it looked like could only be people that were living at that time.
But it's one of
And you had to have so many recommendations from XYZ people, and just looked like a hell of a lot of work to get it. That'd be interesting, if you could.
You're thinking of Erwin Abrams?
Irvin Abrams, that's it, exactly. But apparently I don't know if you nominate anybody, but I can swear there was a New York Times crossword puzzle this week, a clue that said the only person to be nominated posthumously and receive a Nobel or a Nobel Prize of some kind. And so,
Did you know who it was?
I didn't know. I can't understand those things.
Well, as I say, there's just to me amazing how many things. And if you look on the liquid breathing and artificial blood, those are just starting to bloom. I mean, it's just, and there's a lot more applications. In fact, I have thought of a few that I haven't documented that, that aren't even in those using the fluids, but not in the artificial blood or liquid breathing. It's just amazing. All right, questions? Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is.